everyone. It's April 10, the 100th day of the year. There are 265 days remaining, obviously. As you can see from the picture behind me, it's a beautiful day in our neighborhood here in Brunswick, Maine. For those of you that may not recognize it, that is the river that separates Brunswick from Topsham here in beautiful Maine on the coast. We're so happy that you've joined us today. It's going to be a wonderful day. Our scripture for the day is found in Jeremiah 17:7. It says, "Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord and whose hope is in the Lord." Oh, so on a personal note, thank you all for your verbal, written, and silent thoughts and prayers for our family over the recent loss of my mother earlier this week. That was very comforting and much appreciated. Okay, well, let's move into this week's program. I want to get back to our ongoing series about the history of pandemics and epidemics and what we've learned from them. Let's visit another key learning from these historic events. Names. What's in a name? We're going to talk about that today. In 1918, Roy Grist, a U.S. Army doctor, watched bodies pile up in a makeshift morgue. He could have come to terms with the tragic losses if those men, in the prime of their lives, had been killed by gunfire on the Western Front. But these doughboys had died from a mysterious disease. Oh, the weeks that followed saw death like Grist had never seen before. In fact, October 1918 is still the deadliest single month in American history. Not since the Black Death had so many people died in so short a time. But let's back up a bit to earlier in 1918. The first officially recorded case of what has been called the mother of all pandemics occurred in early March 1918 at a U.S. Army training camp in Kansas. A mess cook named Albert Gitchell complained of flu-like symptoms in the morning, and by noon, 107 soldiers were stricken. 5 weeks later, over 1,000 soldiers were infected and 47 were dead. The deadly influenza annihilated overcrowded Army training camps populated by 1 million new recruits. And the troops that were sent to Europe in 1918 were affected with microbes that killed more than their guns did. The flu subsided in the summer, but a second, more powerful infection swept across the United States after 2 sailors in Boston contracted the illness. The flu quickly reached nearby military installations, such as Camp Devens, before spreading to civilian populations across the country. The outbreak at Camp Devens confounded Grist and his fellow physicians. They worked 16-hour days to quell the tide just northwest of Boston. Within hours of reporting initial symptoms, mahogany spots dotted soldiers' cheeks, and then faces turned such a dark shade of blue, purple, and then black from a lack of oxygen in their blood. Grist reported, quote, "It became hard to distinguish the colored men from the white." Some saw an enemy hard at work. Rumors spread that the Kaiser's U-boats had released poison clouds in American ports, and that the German pharmaceutical company Bayer had tainted its aspirin tablets. Preachers such as Billy Sunday blamed sin for the seemingly biblical plague. You may have heard stories of the outbreak. In Philadelphia, there were drivers of open carts, and they kept a near constant vigil, circling the streets while hollering, "Bring out your dead, bring out your dead," to collect the bodies. While news of the influenza was suppressed in the United States, France, and Great Britain due to the ongoing war, such was not the case in Spain, which remained neutral during World War I. Wire service reports of a flu outbreak in Madrid in the spring of 1918 led to the pandemic being called the Spanish flu. The pandemic, while it didn't originate in Spain, still is referred to by many as the Spanish flu pandemic, tainting the seat of the Spanish Empire more than 100 years later. More than 195,000 Americans died in 1918. For perspective, the deadliest month for coronavirus in the US was January of this year, in which 95,245 deaths were reported. So that statistic, combined with deaths from the war, dropped the life expectancy of the American male from 51 years to only 39. By 1920, 675,000 Americans had died from the influenza strain, and 1/3 of the planet's population was infected, resulting in 50 million deaths worldwide. The combination of the flu and the war made Americans afraid of what was out there in the wider world. So there was a growing notion of becoming an isolationist country and keeping out foreign elements, says Kenneth Davis, author of More Deadly Than War, The Hidden History of the Spanish Flu and the First World War. Davis continues by stating, quote, "It combines for a period of great fear of communism, Bolshevism, and socialism. There's a tremendous growth of the Ku Klux Klan because people were afraid of what was foreign. The whole nativist impulse was fed by people's fear generated by flu and war." Some scholars have since suggested that dubbing it the Spanish flu sent the inaccurate message that it was a distant threat, thus delaying steps to prevent it in the United States. Similar themes resonate today. CU Boulder history professor Susan Kent notes, in the debate over terms like Wuhan flu and Chinese flu to describe the current day coronavirus. So, how many of you knew the history of the influenza pandemic in 1918? I didn't until investigating further. I assumed incorrectly from the name that the flu originated in Spain, not in the US. I'm sure many others believe that as well. Today, though, we're smarter. Today, we're more learned. Today, we're less likely to point an accusatory finger at that which we fear or is unknown to us. Or are we? Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord and whose hope is in the Lord. Please keep that in mind and don't jump to any rash conclusions. Well, today we have Brendan joining us, Brendan Kruger. He's our esteemed Sabbath School study leader for today. So Brendan, it's all up to you now. Let's get started. We can't hear you, Brendan. Oh, there you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
You can. Can I hear
you're
you?
A little, you're a little quiet. So
you guys?
If you can speak up a little, just a little louder, I think we'll be fine.
There we go. I had a little problem on mine. I think I can hear you now.
Oh, good.
Right.
Okay.
Now, last week, someone told me I was really soft, so I'm just wanting to make sure that I'm capable of being heard today.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So, on the note of the Spanish flu and World War I, people are looking to put their trust in something. The lesson today talks about covenants. Who do we put our trust in, and can we trust God who makes covenants? So today is going to be a bit of an overview, and whatever mistakes that I might make today will be corrected next week. I believe we have a guest Sabbath School teacher, is that correct? So, excuse me, Michael Hazel, one of the authors of the companion book, along with his late father, Gerhard Hazel, he will be here and we'll be discussing the lesson. And I believe he's going to try to come back at some later point in our quarter. So last week we left off with the fall of humanity due to our parents' sin. This week is a quick summary of the whole quarter as we take each day to look at the early covenants. And these were, according to the lesson, present truth manifestations of the true covenant, the one ratified at Calvary by the blood of Jesus, and the one that we enter into. The lesson begins with the covenant God made with Noah. And then it proceeds to Abraham, and then to Sinai, and then finally we look at what is called the new covenant, the ones that all the others pointed to. So this is just a sneak preview. How many of you feel like you are experts at all the covenants that we're going to talk about? I see you all raising your hands. Very good. I can't say that I feel like I'm an expert on all of them, but let's take a quick look at this. What does the word covenant mean?
Well, Brendan, I think if we look at the Latin, it means to come together, to move together.
Okay. To move together, to covenant. Once in a while, you hear someone use the word today. Hey, let's covenant together. All right. So, what are some other definitions of covenant?
I like the thought of being in agreement.
In agreement. Okay.
Is it like a promise?
A promise. I think these are all parts of the definition. This is probably in our lesson study. I sometimes get the lesson study notes and my investigations mixed up, but the Hebrew word is spelled B-E-R-I-T-H. I'm assuming it's pronounced berit, but we would say berith in English. This is when two parties are bound together. And in the Bible, there are two kinds of being bound together between two individuals. Can you tell me the two?
A marriage?
Okay, and that would be an example, and that's a specific example of what I'm talking about, a more general example, which is human to human. Okay, so human to human, you can have a covenant between humans. And then the other one is
Human to God.
human to God, and it's usually God to human.
God, yeah.
But yes, you're correct. According to the lesson study, a covenant is an arrangement that has three basic elements. One, God affirms covenant promises with an oath. Okay. Now, let's look up really quickly here, Hebrews 6:13 and 17. Hebrews 6:13 and 17. And if someone would read those two verses.
When God made his promise to Abraham, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, he swore by himself. That's 13 and 17.
Yes.
Because God wanted to make the unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what was promised, he confirmed it with an oath.
So usually when there's an oath, you swear on something. Who does God swear an oath to and why? Anybody?
Well,
Let's start with the easy one. Who does God swear an oath to? That's in
himself.
Himself. Okay. Why does he swear an oath to himself? Any guesses?
There's no one higher.
Who can God swear an oath to outside of himself? He can't find anyone higher than he is, so he has to swear an oath to himself. That's going to come up in just a little bit again. Okay, the second element that the lesson study brings out is the covenant obligation is obedience to God's will as expressed in the 10 Commandments. So the lesson study says that if there's a covenant made, there is a requirement of obedience on our part. Everyone okay with that? Okay. And the means by which God's covenant obligation is ultimately fulfilled is through Christ and the plan of salvation. All right, and that's found in Isaiah 42, 1 and 6. You can look that up on your own. But that's what the lesson mentioned as three of the elements. I'd like to just throw in a few more before we dive into some specifics with Noah and Moses and Abraham. A covenant is a strong, solemn agreement between two parties. In the Bible, when two parties make a covenant, they are joined together and identified with each other. Now think about that when we talk about the rest of these covenants coming. I'm going to give you this one and a few more, and I'm going to supply examples from Jonathan and David's relationship to support this. And if you have any thoughts of other biblical stories where this takes place, please let me know. So in the Bible, when two parties make a covenant, they're joined together and identified with each other. At every covenant's core, there is a change in relationship. Something changes in the relationship. In the case of Jonathan and David, Jonathan gives David his coat and other items after making a covenant with him. Now, Jonathan is the prince, and Jonathan is giving David his coat and giving David other things. It's almost like he's accepting that David is, greater than he. But anyway, that's an example of a smaller covenant in which somebody gives things, there's a relationship change. Can you think of any other instances in the Bible in a covenant when a relationship might change?
Do you think between Paul and Timothy?
Okay. There are probably many of these, especially when we talk about human to human covenants, where two people make an agreement or an oath, they're bonded together in some way, and there's a relationship change. How about this? Covenants involve promises. It's not a random thing when you make a covenant. The agreement usually includes some sort of practical application. For example, what does Jonathan do as a part of his covenant? He protects David from who? From Saul, his dad. So that's a pretty serious thing. So Jonathan actually makes a promise that's a serious promise, and he actually protects David from Saul, who can get quite angry. Covenants involve families and bloodlines. In the Bible, two parties may make a covenant that is intended to last for generations. What about David and Jonathan? David and Jonathan made a covenant, and when Jonathan died, was the covenant over? Can you think of an example where David applied this covenant beyond Jonathan?
Was it to his offspring?
Correct. Do you remember when David took care of Jonathan's relative, Mephibosheth?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a continuation. It goes farther than just the two humans. And covenants are usually spiritually charged. David and Jonathan, for example, call God as a witness between them. So they trust a divine being to hold them accountable. This is, plays a little bit into who does God swear an oath to, himself. God keeps himself accountable. But for us, we appeal to a higher authority to keep us accountable. And then covenants are not easily broken. The people making the covenants often slaughtered animals back in the day to demonstrate what should happen to the one who breaks the covenant. For example, Jonathan calls on God to kill him if he does not alert David of danger. That harkens back to the day when they would cut animals in half and walk between them. Do you remember the story in the Bible where God appeared, I think, like a light, a torch, lantern, or whatever, and passed through the animals? We're going to probably talk about that later. What is that saying? And that's we think of it as a little bit strange, but what is that saying to the person making the oath passing between the animals? Anybody?
Yeah.
Acceptance.
It's a serious thing because what you're saying is basically, if I fail to keep my oath, if I fail to keep my promise, may it happen to me what happens to these animals. It's not a light kind of casual promise. It's a serious thing. And so,
Brendan,
all right. Yes.
Brendan, talking about covenants, a strange one is Rahab and the two spies.
Okay. Elaborate.
They talked back and forth. Each was expected to do something, including the scarlet rope or whatever it was that was out the window.
Mhm.
And the far-reaching result is Christ came through Rahab, through her being part of the Christ lineage.
That's right. So you could see a number of aspects in what I just mentioned in that story. It's a practical application. She vowed to protect the men. There's a solemn agreement, and there's a change in their relationship for sure. We can see where it involves bloodlines and families. Way down the line, that covenant that she made with those men is seen in her progeny, correct? And so you can see all these aspects that kind of apply to the covenant relationship. That's a great example. Thank you, Peter. All right, so do you think that the covenant with Noah is the first covenant that God has with man? No. We probably talked about it last week, but what is the first covenant? It's not necessarily stated as a covenant, but it's, according to what I've read, it's more of an implied covenant. But can you tell me what that
Actually,
is?
between Adam and Eve and God.
That's right.
Genesis 3:15.
Yeah, it's a right away from the very beginning, God covenants with man. All right. So we're going to touch back on that story in a little bit. But 1,565 years later, according to certain chronologies, a man called Noah is on the scene. And so somebody, would you please read for me Isaiah 54:9, and also would somebody please read Genesis 9:15. Whoever has Genesis 9:15, if you'd read that first, and then the person can read Isaiah 54:9. Yes, Tammy.
I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind. Never again will the waters become a flood to destroy all life.
Okay. And now Isaiah 54:9. Who has that?
For this is like the,
Go ahead.
okay. For this is like the waters of Noah to me. For as I have sworn that the waters of Noah would no longer cover the earth, so I have sworn that I would not be angry with you nor rebuke you.
Brendan,
Yes.
I would be amiss to myself if I didn't say in this discussion, God gave the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time.
That's a good poetic way to remember it. So
Well,
we have a covenant.
can I just say, I don't know, tell me where your translation was, but on my translation, it says, the word again is this, I will never, that I've sworn that I will not do it again. And I like that word. He's not going to do it again.
Yeah, maybe I didn't read it right, but mine says, never again will the waters become a flood
Yeah.
to destroy all life.
I'm sorry, I missed it.
That's okay.
Yes.
I might have missed it.
So, and I lost it here in my notes, but does anyone have the opening Bible text for our lesson study? And if you do, would you read it in the lesson?
The memory text,
Yes.
I have it, but somebody else might.
Go ahead, Tammy.
Now, therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine. Obviously, that's King James, right out of the lesson.
All right. Before we dive too deeply into covenant with Noah, would you read that one more time, unless you put it away?
Can I read it out of, do you want that version?
Whichever one. You can give another version if you'd like.
I'll give you another one. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession, although the whole earth is mine.
Doesn't that smack a little bit of, maybe this is the wrong way to say it, you got to pay to play? Doesn't it sound a little bit like righteousness by works?
Well, it's scary because it's, we are not really capable of keeping a covenant in every particular. Historically, I don't know that it's ever been done perfectly.
Yes, Peter, did you have a question or a comment?
But the other, maybe I don't want to say the other side of the coin. I agree with you that we might think that it's pay to play, but on the other hand, it shows, especially in Noah's account, that he trusted God enough to get on the boat.
So
to build the boat, which
yeah, actually, didn't it?
Yeah, but to get on the boat.
Right. Roberta, did you have a comment? Okay.
No.
Your box just lit up.
I was just saying also, Peter, that building a boat, a boat, what is a boat? And yet Noah followed God's instructions very, very closely on building the boat in the first place. Now, entering the boat was, to me, the period on acceptance of God's promise to keep Noah safe during that a flood was coming.
I heard a discussion on this. It was probably on one of the Sabbath School classes that you can watch during the week. And I think they made a good point. This is one of those cherry picking texts, or one of these proof texts that you can use out of context. And if one of the good reasons of studying all these covenants is that it will probably put that text into perspective. And if you look at all these stories, just keep in mind, what does man have to do versus what God has done or has to do? And I think if we look at that as we go through these stories, it's going to make a lot more sense.
Well, Brendan, I'm sorry. I also think that we have to look at the context of when and where. He was talking to a people who had totally lost a relationship with him. And so they were little toddlers, and he's like, you got to obey mommy and daddy here, and, it'll be okay for you. Whereas later when he came, he says to his disciples, I'm your friend, so I think we've got to be willing to look at the context of who he's talking to.
Right. The idea that if you look at the first covenant, what had God just done? Which, you know, I'm sure we could all do this. He just created the universe, okay? I mean, God just did something so fantastic that we can't even conceive of the idea. He had formed a loving relationship with human beings, and then they broke off that relationship, and God makes a covenant with them that he's going to have to pay the price.
Mm.
And so, yes, he asks us to do things, but the thing is, when you look at everything he's done before, during, and after, it puts it, I think, in complete perspective about how little we're required to do. And basically, we're required to believe and obey, but the obedience comes out of a faith and trust. Like Alice and Peter were talking about Noah in the ark. We're going to discuss that right now. God is very involved before, during, and after to a much greater degree than Noah is. And Noah has just a few obligations, and we'll talk about them right now. So we read the text in Genesis and also Isaiah about Noah. So what was a covenant that God made with Noah, and where do we find this covenant?
Genesis 6, verse 18.
And Roberta, do you have that with you?
I do.
Would you please read it?
But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. Noah did everything just as God commanded him.
Okay. So this is the first time the word covenant appears in the Bible, according to my understanding. Although we've just talked about there have been at least one prior covenant with Adam. Even though the world is in deep trouble and sin is destroying everything, God fulfills his covenant relationship that existed right after the fall with Adam. God is going to protect those who are willing to live in a relationship with him. So that's something that harkens back 1,500 years before. God has just told Noah that he was going to destroy the earth because of the overwhelming spread of sin. But although the world will be destroyed, God is not forsaking the world he created. He continues to offer the covenant relationship that he set in motion after the fall of Adam and Eve. And he himself offers to protect any family members who are willing to live in a committed relationship with him, one that involves obedience. So, were there any requirements of Noah? Roberta just read a couple. What did Noah have to do? Because covenants involve more than one party, right? So here we have a God to human covenant. God is saying what he's going to do. What does Noah have to do?
He built an ark and warned the world.
So he builds an ark. It takes quite a while, but he builds this thing, and he does warn the world. And then God asks him to
store food for the animals. He had to feed these animals that were coming.
So he has to gather food, and he has to gather the animals. It says that God brought the animals, but also said that Noah was to put them in the ark. So he had to have a place for them. So what was God's covenant promise then? It's kind of tough to build a big boat by hand and to feed some animals. But what does God do? And what is he going to do? Well, I look back at it and I kind of get the idea. God created the world in the first place, so he already did the heavy lifting. He created all the animals. He made all the food. He probably told Noah how to raise them and raise the food. And then Noah has to get these animals in their pens on the ark. But then what is God going to do for Noah that no one else can do?
Keep them safe during the flood.
Right. And when you read the Bible story, the language there is pretty amazing about the upheaval that this flood causes. And if you read what Ellen White says about it, she fleshes it out in greater detail. And even though they were on the ark, I get the idea that none of them should have survived. It was basically because God protected them. I think the phrase angels who excelled in strength had to keep the ark together. So, and then God still, he tells them how to survive the ark. They have enough food. They have enough animals there to repopulate the world. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, God has the greater, number of promises to keep in this covenant. Now,
And then I just had one question and there's no answer. There's no answer in the Bible, but we know that Methuselah died just before the flood. So Methuselah was believed in God. Sometimes I wonder how many people, because Noah was not only directing the building of the ark, but he was preaching to the people. He was telling them that a flood was coming and they laughed at him. But I also wonder, maybe there were those who believed who died before the flood came. And it's just a thought, and there's no answer in the Bible, but except for Methuselah.
Methuselah, we know he died immediately before the flood, according to chronology. So there is that evidence. Yes. And if you believe what some people believe about the end of time, there is that thought that some people will be put to sleep before the end. So I think the flood and the end of the world are very similar stories in many respects. So,
Brendan?
Yes.
Brendan, is part of this covenant promise the actual bringing about of the flood?
Yes, I'm sure it is. Either that, and of course, this is a big question. I'm not sure we have time to go into it. Did God cause the flood and kill all those people, or did the flood happen because of whatever man was doing at the time and created an environment that was unsustainable? But yes, the flood had to happen. When God said the world would be destroyed by a flood, the flood had to happen. What would it be if the flood never showed up? On top of that,
but Brendan,
yes.
a part of the covenant was the promise in Genesis that he was going to, fix it all. And if he had not done that, there was no path for the Messiah to come.
Right.
And so that was part of his covenant. As much as it grieved his heart, all the men were wicked beyond saving, and we had to have a path for Jesus to come through.
That thought you have, the path, I'm going to hopefully end the lesson with that, and it may be familiar to you, but I thought it was an interesting concept. With the flood happening, I think it is important. When I read it again this week, the one word that helped me understand a little bit more was the word grieved. If you read the Bible, it says that God grieved. That's not just a soft cry. That's a deep, deep feeling. And so I think regardless of, the flood, how it happened, whether God just knew naturally it was going to happen or whether God brought it himself, because the Bible does seem to indicate he caused it to happen. God didn't do it out of some capriciousness or callousness. He grieved deeply for it, and he knew that it was a terrible thing to.
Where do you see that word, Brendan? I'd like to see it.
It's in my Bible, but maybe it's not in yours. And of course, you would ask me, and my notes are all confused.
That's all right. If you find it,
I will get back to you after Sabbath School, unless I run into it on my journey through Sabbath School.
Mm-hmm.
Brendan, Larry
Genesis
says it's 6:6.
I was just going to say Genesis 6:6.
Thank you.
around the Genesis 6:8 text, but I wasn't sure.
I'm right on that page.
The Lord grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain.
Yeah.
So, well, that gives it a slightly different, he grieved that he made us. It doesn't sound so much like he grieved, and believe me, I know that God is all loving and kindness, but just this verse sounds like he wasn't grieving that he had to destroy, he grieved that he made.
Sure. Well, I hesitated to go down that route today, and that's for another time. Let's keep talking to the covenant. All right. So God makes this deal with Noah. Was there a lot at stake here? I mean, what would have happened if God could not have saved Noah and his family?
Tout fini.
Think about it.
That would have been the end of the world.
Bev's comment about a pathway. The pathway would have been closed, right? So this was a serious thing. When God makes a promise, a big one like this, he has to deliver, because not just to prove that he's powerful enough to deliver, but this would have shut down the entire pathway to the Messiah. This is a serious business. All of mankind would have been wiped out. All right. It does, I think it was a lesson or somewhere, it does talk about the covenant with Noah is not necessarily redemptive, but it's necessary for God's redemptive plan. And that's kind of going along with what we talk about, this pathway. It does save Noah, but we do have issues with Noah immediately right after too, which we don't need to go into as well. And I like the way one author put it. The rainbow, Peter, the rainbow is God withdrawing his weapon of war. It's kind of like a memo to himself. It's like a memo in the sky. Every time we see that, we see God's memo that he will never destroy the world like that again. Also, one other thing I think is important to note, some people argue that Noah's flood was a local event, not worldwide, right? If that's true, that it was a local event, what would this mean logically? How many local floods have we had in this world since? Even big ones.
Too many to count.
We've had probably thousands, if not more. So God would not be keeping his covenant over and over and over again if that was the case, if only local floods, if it was only a local flood.
Well, I think
Right,
that
and also,
nature shows the results of the.
Kind of with Noah in chapter 9, where God had once said to Adam in Genesis 1, he says now to Noah in Genesis 9:1, be fruitful and multiply, increase in number and fill the earth. This is a second start. And with a second start comes a covenant. It doesn't necessarily establish precedent, a uniqueness, but it does establish precedence. Noah is the first in a series of people that God makes a commitment to, that he says, I'm making a covenant with you. All right. So 422 years later, after the flood, Abraham decides to leave Chaldea. All right. Let's read, please. Someone, if you could find Genesis 12, 1-3. And also, if somebody could read Galatians 3, 6-9 and 29. Genesis 12 first. Who has that?
The Lord had said to Abram, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you.
That's a big promise. All right. How about let's consider what was written about Abraham in Galatians 3, 6-9. Who has that?
I have it, Brendan. Consider Abraham. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Understand then that those who believe are children of Abraham. The scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announce the gospel in advance to Abraham. All the nations will be blessed through you. So those who have faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith.
And verse 29 says, if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. All right. So Abraham is asked to leave what?
His home
Pretty much everything, right? His
and
father,
family.
leave his people, leave his home, his house, and go somewhere where he's never been. Now, we don't think much of that because we can hop on a plane and we can be in, Buenos Aires, Argentina within 12 hours, okay? But this is back in the day where most people probably didn't go 10 miles beyond their home. This is a major undertaking. It requires faith. Now, let me ask you this question, going back to Noah. How much trust and faith in God did Noah have to build the ark? Probably a lot. But he did have Methuselah and he had other people supporting him. When the ark opened up and all the animals came on, I'm sure he was feeling, okay, this is a sign, and he gets on. But let me ask you, how do you think Noah and his family were feeling after 4 or 5 days being locked in the ark with nothing happening?
Yeah. Like us in the pandemic.
it involves a lot of faith and trust in something, right?
Yeah.
You're wondering what's going on. Abraham has to do the same thing. He has to say, okay, am I willing to commit to this God? Do I have the faith and trust in him that I'm just going to get up and go? And so,
But Brendan,
yes.
God shut the door of the ark?
He did.
But does that mean that only God could open the door?
That's true, but you have to wonder what he was thinking.
Because maybe they could hear the taunts and jeers of the people outside.
I'm sure that it was very apparent. So Genesis 12:3 talks about blessing Abraham and cursing others that curse him, and everyone in the earth shall be blessed. So the covenant plays a central role in the biblical storyline, and God promises Abraham offspring, land, and blessing. Offspring, land, and blessing. So how has this promise been fulfilled? Anybody?
Oh, number one, he established the place where Israel eventually would develop a country.
Yeah. That's the land.
And of course, it was only through Israel, only through Judah and Israel, that Christ would come, the Savior.
That's the universal blessing. It's amazing how God in advance can see all these things playing out. All those who belong to Jesus by faith are children of
Abraham.
All right. So what was Abram required to do? He was required to go, right?
And believe.
To leave, believe and leave. And Abraham did by faith. The key here is that obedience is necessary for Abraham, but just like Noah, he obeys because of what?
His belief, his faith.
Trust and
Trust.
I don't think it's because they're going to get something so much as they actually trust and believe in God. I think the stakes were too high for anything else. If you think about it.
He had no idea where he was going.
That's right.
Brendan, Noah didn't know that it was going to be 40 days in the ark. Otherwise, he would have been marking off the days ahead of time, countdown.
Probably.
The same with Abraham. He didn't know
when that descendant child was going to be born. So he took upon himself, of course, to try to help God along. But if he had been told ahead of time, they would have known, okay, it's going to be soon or it's far off. So it had to require faith on their part to believe what God told them.
And like you said, it wasn't faith for a week or two. We're talking about faith for a long time.
Yes.
Abraham goes for years and years to the point where he thinks it's not going to happen. And then all sorts of troubles ensue. But yeah, you're right. It's a long process. It's not just once and done and everything's fine. All right.
There's a lot of hope, Brendan, though, because if you look at Noah and Abraham both, they weren't perfect, but God accounted them righteous because of their faith and stepping out and just saying, okay, I'm going to go in that direction. And both of them made pretty bad human errors after that. And I think that's good news.
And isn't it amazing how Adam and Eve sinned and immediately God made a covenant with them?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he knew what happened. I mean, it was right there, right in their faces. And he still said, listen, this is what I'm going to do for you. This is the promise I'm going to make to you. It's going to be okay. It's going to be all right in the end. We're going to have a hard time along the way, but it's going to be all right in the end. So we talked about the going through the dead animals, death to whoever makes the oath if they don't keep it. We talked about how Abraham would bless the world through his line and Jesus would come. And then I wanted to point one thing out before we move to Moses. If you look at Genesis 12, 1 through 3 again, and look at it, it says God's going to give him land. He's going to make him a blessing and this kind of thing. I want you to consider this. Early on, when Adam and Eve fell, God pronounced 3 curses at the fall that dealt with the initial blessing. Initially, Adam and Eve had a tight relationship with God. The human-to-human relationship was good, and the human-to-land relationship was good. When man fell, the relationship with God was severed, so the image of God was hurt. Childbirth caused pain, whether it's physical or emotional pain. And the land developed what? Thorns.
Weeds.
Look at the 3 blessings for Abraham. I think this is amazing. The 3 blessings of Abraham counter these 3 curses. It's like God is starting out again. Abraham gets a blessing. Abraham becomes what Adam was intended to be with his relationship with God. Isn't that great? Abraham becomes what Adam intended to be. The relationship between man and God is fixed up a bit. Then God pronounces that he's going to have many children. The curse of childbearing is now reversed, and now all of a sudden there's a positivity to childbearing.
It still hurts a lot.
Yes, remember I said emotional pain? Maybe it's more with emotional, you never know.
No, you'll never know. Some of us know.
No, but what I'm saying by that is this. We've talked about it before. There is pain with childbirth, but I'm told that not all women have pain with childbirth. So I'm told. You will have to wonder if some of the pain that is talked about is more to do with the fact that sin was brought in the world and children are going to be doing things and pain is going to occur and all these other things. And I know there's pain in childbirth too. But what's interesting is this whole thing counteracts that. And also it gives them a promised land. No more thorns. It deals with the thorn aspect of it. So Abraham's blessings, study that if you want. They counteract the curses given in Genesis, early on in Genesis with Adam and Eve after they fell. I think that's really neat. So God sees to counteracting all the curses that naturally came about from sin. All right, so down to Moses, about 400 years later. It's interesting, there's about 450 on average years between all these events, except for the fall to Noah. Even all the way down to Jesus Christ. Major events, about 450 years. Lord says to Moses a couple things. Genesis 6, 1 through 8. Does someone have that? Genesis 6, 1 through 8.
I do, unless somebody else wants to.
Preach it.
When men began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they married, and any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not. Am I reading the wrong place?
Yeah.
You said Genesis. I think you meant Exodus.
I meant Exodus.
Okay, thank you.
I certainly don't want to get into the Nephilim right now.
Yeah. Okay, then. Just one more page turn.
I'll leave that for someone else when they teach class.
All right. Then the Lord said to Moses, now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Am I in the right place?
Yes.
Okay. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country. God also said to Moses, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty. But by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, where they lived as aliens. Moreover, I have heard the groanings of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord.
All right. So now that you've read this, Tammy's off the hook because she did the reading. She can only answer if she wants to. What covenant was God talking about?
Freeing the Israelites under the rule of Pharaoh.
Okay.
And he had previously, which is Abraham's covenant, because they are the children of Israel.
So he's hearkening back to that, because I established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, right? And so now we're in a different spot. The children of Israel are not being treated well. There are many of them, and they're in Egypt, and they've been enslaved. And God is like, I made a covenant. I aim to keep that promise. I'm going to free you. All right, so he makes, so how is the Exodus a fulfillment on his part of the covenantal promise?
The land part of the covenant, to give them land.
That's right.
Well, I think is preservation. If the Israelites had to stay in Egypt, the country would not have been reestablished, and while the promise of Christ was to come through them.
So
was it to be in Egypt, or was it to be in their own land?
So Bev mentioned a pathway. Alice, you brought up more than once. There's something further down the road that has to happen. How does it happen if sin destroys everything? It can't happen. So God makes a covenant with Adam and Eve for down the road. If every human being on the world is destroyed, how can down the road be fulfilled? It can't. So God saves people. If his people are enslaved in Egypt and are not allowed to worship the way they are supposed to, and if they're forgetting their ways and they don't have their land, how is down the road supposed to be fulfilled? God has to keep the path open somehow. And
Brendan?
so, yes.
I guess I kind of have a simple mind in my old age. To me, these are all parts of the covenant from the very beginning of Genesis. He maybe adjusts things as he has to because of circumstances, but they're all a covenant of love to keep going forward so that at the end of this great controversy, it'll be done. And every covenant is a covenant of love. He just has to change the words because of us sometimes.
So would you call this covenant a covenant of grace to Moses and the children of Israel? They deserve it?
We don't deserve anything.
Think about it for a minute. Adam and Eve, they sinned, they caused seemingly irreparable damage between God and man. They didn't deserve anything, but what did God do? He gave them a covenant, which is really of grace. Look at Noah. I mean, we know Noah wasn't perfect for sure. Look at what happened after the flood. We don't know exactly, but God gave mankind the covenant of grace. He saved mankind, even though they probably didn't deserve it. We know the world was horrible back then. We don't know exactly how, but it was horrible. Look at Moses and the children of Israel. They're not practicing their beliefs as much as they used to. They're enslaved. God gives them his covenant of grace. They don't deserve this, but God is going to follow through with his promise, period. And also keep that lane open for Jesus Christ to come.
Well, you kind of have touched a few times on a question I wanted to bring out, because in the beginning, you were stressing how a covenant is this agreement between two parties, and woe to you if you don't uphold your end of the bargain. If you walk through the animals and may this happen to me if I don't keep my part of it. But really, we don't keep our part of it time and time and time again.
Yes, but who made the covenant with who?
Yeah, God made it.
Made the covenant.
Who does God swear an oath to?
Himself.
So
these are
obviously the covenant doesn't depend on both parties.
Depends on God in this case. And I think God knows that, which is why
I agree, and then I disagree.
Go ahead, disagree.
I think that there's a certain amount of trust and faith that has to go in on the part of mankind.
Sure.
In order for the covenant we have to believe in God. We have to trust in him. And I think that's what happened in all of this. As far as the covenant relationship, they couldn't see the future, but they trusted in God.
So the covenant relationship with Noah was made between God and who? Noah. It had implications for the future.
Yeah, he keeps it to this day, whether you're in covenant relationship with him or not. He does not let the flood cover the whole world.
But Noah was credited with righteousness. I mean, Abraham and Noah, they believed, they followed what God said, and so they kept their end of the bargain.
Yeah.
But people after them did not. And maybe they didn't even after that, to a point, but they did. They kept the agreement. Noah built the ark. He put everyone on board and he followed what God said. Abraham, he dabbled with disbelief here and there, but he ultimately believed totally in God, and that promise was carried out. His generations afterward fell off the path. Now we have Moses. Go ahead.
You think about the Israelites, all that the Lord has said we will do. Those are such scary words to utter. And yet they said it time and time again. And it was just a constant volleying back and forth. We're reading in Judges right now, Rob and I. And I mean, the whole Old Testament right through Judges is this back and forth, back and forth. They obeyed the Lord. They turned their backs on the Lord.
Yeah, it's probably tough reading at times.
It's very tough.
So we're almost out of time. I want to, we're all heading toward this new covenant, and that's where we are now. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. We all know this part. I will put my law
in their hearts,
in their minds, and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more.
Praise God.
Beautiful.
This is everything that's happened from Adam and Eve has been pointing toward this covenant. All right? It's a great covenant.
Brendan?
Yes.
I think we have to realize that all these, Noah, Abraham, all of them, they did this with God's power. In other words, it almost sounds like, well, we've got to do this and that. We have to accept Jesus as our Savior. And we're told that the Holy Spirit will give us the power. Even when we make mistakes, he'll forgive. But it's God's doing that really helps, is the reason that we can even be part of this covenant.
So Bev, I hope I'm right on this, but when did this covenant get promised? I think it was promised as a rebellious Israel was about to be expelled from the promised land, which was an actualization of the most severe covenant curse. So the children of Israel are under the covenant curse. They didn't follow what they were supposed to, and they're getting booted out. And God says, I will do this. I think it's pretty amazing. And maybe I'm reading this wrong, but God basically gives an unconditional divine promise to an unfaithful Israel at this point. It's kind of like Adam and Eve as they got booted out of the garden. Okay, I'm still going to give you a covenant here. So I think that's pretty interesting.
It's love.
It's a grace covenant. So what's that?
Well,
it's love.
And my question.
It's all about love. God initiates it. He fulfills it by grace. He doesn't make the covenant sound like a legal document. It sounds like something that's positive. It sounds very loving. And what's different about this covenant? Does it point to anything? What are our obligations? Is it works-based? What's different about this than the other covenants that have happened in the past?
Well, can I ask a question before?
Sure.
What does it say when God says he's going to write it on their minds and in their hearts? What is different between my brain saying I'm going to follow God and my heart saying I'm going to follow God? I mean, what is the meaning of this?
Well, that's an awesome question. And you answered it with 1 minute left in the study. We should have an afterglow and talk about that. Do you have a quick answer?
Well, again, he empowers it. He gives us the power and the grace to do it.
I wish I remembered it better. About a year, 2 or 3 years ago now, we had a lady, PhD, who specialized in brain and heart kind of things. And she spoke to our teachers retreat, and she talked about the relationship between the heart and the brain, and how, when the Bible talks about the heart, it means something way more. And maybe this is something I could dig up and we could talk about.
Oh, are you going right now?
Oops. Oops, we're getting some commentary.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
I'm going
All
to
right.
close, Mr. Pierce, by saying
So,
the Old Testament is the avenue that God is keeping open at all costs for the coming of the Messiah. So the Old Testament is like the pathway that God is keeping open at all costs for the coming of the Messiah. He's constantly working to keep that lane open. Satan is trying to close the lane. God has to respond in any way he can to keep that lane open. After the coming of Christ, some of these things are no longer necessary because these covenant promises all lead to Christ. And so things change a little bit at that point. But I never thought of it that way before. To some degree, at least, the Old Testament is really the avenue that God used to keep the pathway open at all costs.
Good
All
thought.
right. Well, thank you, Brendan, for leading our study time today. We appreciate that. We appreciate you. And thank you, Zoom and YouTube participants, for studying with us. We appreciate you as well and enjoy you being here with us each week as a family. At the Brunswick Church, we offer 2 in-person worship services. The first is at 9 a.m. The second is at 11:20, and that second program is broadcast on our YouTube channel. Please stay tuned to our website, Facebook page, emails, and texts to see the latest news about our changing programs in the weeks to come as we balance more in-person programs and as COVID restrictions are changing here in the state of Maine. And please don't get caught up in a name or in fear-mongering. Do your research. Don't jump to conclusions. Be sure of the truth before you speak and act. Remember, blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord and whose hope is the Lord. This is Eric Pierce broadcasting today from our studio in the Brunswick Adventist Church. I wish you God's peace and blessings.